Welcome to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified, where we try to, make sense of the law, especially for all of you future lawyers out there.
Mm-hmm.
And today we are diving deep into a piece of international law
Okay.
that you might not think about too often, but is surprisingly relevant.
All right.
It's the Geneva Convention II,
Okay.
formerly known as the Geneva Convention for the Amelioration of the Condition of Wounded, Sick, and Shipwrecked Members of Armed Forces at Sea.
You know, it's fascinating how these conventions came about.
Yeah.
They arose from a very real crisis.
Right.
Imagine the Battle of Solferino back in 1859.
Oh, wow.
This Swiss businessman, Henry Dunant,
Mm-hmm.
he saw firsthand just the immense suffering, thousands of wounded soldiers just left there to die.
It's hard to even imagine.
It is.
Yeah.
And, that experience, it really fueled his drive to establish some kind of international agreement to protect victims of war, no matter what side they were on.
Of course, that's the whole point.
Exactly.
So that brings us to Geneva Convention 2.
Okay.
This one specifically deals with naval warfare, right?
That's right.
Is it just basically the same as the first Geneva Convention, but on the water?
Not exactly. It definitely builds on those protections for the wounded and sick that were established in that first convention.
Right.
But it kind of tailors those protections to the unique challenges you face when you're fighting at sea.
Okay, I see.
Like take shipwrecks, for instance.
So we're not just talking about, battleships and submarines.
Right, exactly.
Yeah.
Geneva Convention 2 covers a whole range of situations.
Right.
Shipwrecks, aircraft that have to ditch in the ocean.
Right.
Basically anything that could leave military personnel stranded and vulnerable out there in the water.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
Makes you wonder, though, does a document written back in 1949 really still hold up today?
Right.
Warfare has changed so much.
That's a really important question, and surprisingly, the answer is yes. Geneva Convention 2, like the other Geneva Conventions, has this really remarkable clause.
Okay.
It applies even if a country involved in the conflict hasn't signed it.
Wait, hold on, really?
Yeah.
So even if a country hasn't officially agreed to these rules, they still have to follow them.
Exactly.
How does that even work?
Well, it gets to the heart of what these conventions are all about.
Okay.
They're not just agreements between countries.
Right.
They reflect a deeper set of humanitarian principles that are universally accepted.
Gotcha.
They're considered customary international law, binding on all states, regardless of whether they've officially ratified them.
So it's like a baseline.
Exactly. It's a baseline of humanity.
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So we've established that Geneva Convention 2 has this broad application to naval warfare.
Mm-hmm.
But who exactly are we talking about when we say protected?
Right.
I mean, obviously it's about the wounded, the sick, the shipwrecked.
Right.
But is it really that simple?
Yeah. Well, it's worth digging a little deeper.
Okay.
The convention goes beyond those most obvious categories.
Right.
For example, shipwrecked includes any reason a ship might be lost at sea.
Oh, wow.
Not just attacks from the enemy. It also covers people on board military aircraft that are forced to land in the ocean. No matter why they had to land.
So even a pilot who has to ditch their plane because of like a mechanical failure?
Exactly.
They would still be protected.
Absolutely.
Wow.
And it gets even more interesting. The convention also extends protection to civilian crew members on those military aircraft.
Oh, okay.
War correspondents accompanying the armed forces. Contractors providing services to the military. And even individuals who spontaneously take up arms to resist an invasion.
Wow. That's way more people than I would have thought.
Yeah, it's a pretty broad group.
Okay, so we've got all these people who are protected.
Right.
But protected from what exactly? What does this convention actually require in terms of treatment?
At its core, Geneva Convention 2 mandates humane treatment for all of these individuals.
Right.
That means no murder, no extermination, no torture, no biological experiments, and crucially, no deliberate denial of medical care.
Of course.
These are considered fundamental guarantees.
Yeah. I mean, those all seem like pretty basic common sense things.
They do.
Like you shouldn't even need a treaty to spell that out.
You would hope so.
Right.
But unfortunately, that's not always the case.
Yeah, true.
So are there any specific requirements beyond those general prohibitions?
Yes, there are. And some of these details really show how the convention recognizes those unique vulnerabilities.
Oh, interesting.
For example, it explicitly states that women must be treated with consideration due to their sex.
Okay.
recognizing that they might have specific needs and risks in these situations.
Yeah, that's a really important point.
It is.
Now, the convention also talks about hospital ships, right?
Which are basically floating hospitals in the middle of a war zone.
Yeah.
That's got to be a complicated situation.
It is, and they're a critical part of this convention.
Yeah.
And they receive very specific protections.
Okay.
Geneva Convention 2 states that military hospital ships can never be attacked or captured
Okay.
as long as they are properly marked
Right.
and their presence has been communicated to everyone involved in the conflict.
That makes sense. You don't want anyone accidentally bombing a hospital.
Exactly.
Are there regulations about what types of ships can be used as hospital ships?
There is actually a fascinating detail here.
Oh, okay.
The convention says that even small coastal rescue craft
Okay.
get similar protection, as long as they're only being used for medical activities.
Interesting.
It shows how the convention aims to protect even the smallest players in a naval conflict.
I never would have thought of that.
Yeah.
That's a good point.
So what about larger vessels that are converted to hospital ships? Like a merchant ship that's temporarily being used for medical purposes?
Right.
That's covered too.
Okay.
The convention specifies that once a merchant ship is transformed into a hospital ship, it cannot be used for anything else for the entire duration of the conflict.
So once a hospital ship, always a hospital ship until the war is over.
Exactly.
Gotcha. Okay, so what happens if a hospital ship ends up in enemy territory?
Right.
Like maybe it accidentally sails into a port controlled by the other side.
Yeah, what's the protocol there?
Yeah.
Surprisingly, it's allowed to leave.
Really?
The capturing power can't detain it or use it for their own purposes.
Huh.
They have to let it continue on its humanitarian mission.
Wow.
And this really highlights the convention's commitment to putting medical care above any kind of strategic advantage.
That's pretty remarkable.
It is.
But I imagine they must at least be allowed to search the ship, right?
Of course.
To make sure it's not carrying weapons or, disguised enemy combatants.
Yeah. Absolutely. Parties to the conflict have the right to inspect and search hospital ships.
Right.
They can check the vessel, verify everyone's identity,
Right.
and ensure it's genuinely being used for medical purposes.
Makes sense. They need some way to prevent the system from being abused.
Right.
But what if they find something suspicious?
Okay.
Can they hold the ship indefinitely?
No. The convention puts limits on that.
Okay.
They can refuse assistance from the ship, order it to leave the area, or even direct it to take a specific course.
Okay.
They can also control its use of wireless communication.
Right.
But they can only detain a hospital ship for a maximum of 7 days.
So there are checks and balances.
Exactly.
Okay, we've talked a lot about ships.
We have.
But what about medical aircraft?
Okay.
Do they get the same level of protection as hospital ships?
That's where things get a bit more complicated.
Oh, how so?
Unlike hospital ships, medical aircraft can be attacked. Unless they are flying on pre-agreed routes at specific altitudes and times, and with proper markings.
So it's a lot more conditional. Wow, that seems incredibly risky.
It is.
Why the difference in treatment?
Well, it highlights one of the challenges of applying these conventions to modern warfare.
Okay.
With faster aircraft and advanced weapons.
Right.
It's a lot harder to tell if an aircraft is genuinely a neutral medical aircraft.
Yeah, that makes sense.
Or one that might be used for reconnaissance or even transporting weapons.
Right. So they're trying to balance the protection of medical aircraft
Exactly.
with the reality of modern air combat.
Yeah.
Okay, that makes sense. Now, what about the medical personnel on these ships and aircraft?
Okay.
Are they automatically considered prisoners of war if they're captured?
Not necessarily.
Oh.
Personnel on hospital ships and those who are actively caring for the wounded and sick, they're generally protected from capture.
Okay.
They're considered non-combatants.
Right.
And should be allowed to continue their duties.
Okay.
However, there is a provision that allows for them to be retained
if
they are needed to provide care for prisoners of war.
So they're shielded from capture.
Right.
But they could be obligated to care for enemy soldiers.
Exactly.
That's a tough spot to be in.
It is. It's a delicate balance between protecting medical personnel and addressing the needs of prisoners of war who also have rights under the Geneva Convention.
Absolutely. This has been really eye-opening.
Yeah.
It's clear that Geneva Convention 2 is a lot more intricate than I initially realized.
It is.
I feel like we've only scratched the surface here.
We have.
There's still so much more to uncover.
There is.
Well, we'll have to dig into that in our next segment.
Yeah.
But for now, thank you for joining us for part 1 of our deep dive into Geneva Convention 2.
It's been a pleasure.
We'll be back soon with more insights into this fascinating and surprisingly relevant piece of international law.
Welcome back to LexTalks.
So before the break, we were discussing the very specific protections given to medical personnel and hospital ships under Geneva Convention 2. But it's one thing to have these rules written down. It's another to see how they actually play out in the chaos of war.
Absolutely.
So do we have any historical examples that show how these rules have been upheld?
Yeah, we do.
Or maybe even instances where they were disregarded?
Definitely a really compelling example of the convention being followed is the Falklands War back in 1982.
Oh, yeah.
Despite the intense fighting between the UK and Argentina,
Right.
both sides largely respected the neutrality of those hospital ships.
Right.
They allowed safe passage and didn't attack them.
So they really did uphold the humanitarian spirit of Geneva Convention 2.
They did. It's good to hear.
Yeah, it's heartening to see that even in the middle of a fierce conflict, these conventions can actually make a difference.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
But you mentioned examples where things didn't go so well.
Right. Unfortunately, if we look back at World War II, there were a number of tragic incidents where hospital ships were attacked.
And sometimes even intentionally.
Wow.
These events really highlight the fact that these conventions are only as effective as the willingness of states to actually follow them.
Right. It's not enough to just have the laws on paper.
Exactly.
You have to enforce them and hold people accountable when they break them.
Absolutely. These historical examples really drive that point home.
They do. And it also shows how warfare is constantly evolving.
Right.
And how that affects these conventions.
As technology advances and conflicts get more complex, applying these principles becomes even more challenging.
I see what you mean.
Like, think about cyber warfare.
Okay, yeah.
How do you even define a hospital ship in cyberspace?
Right. It's a whole different ballgame.
It is.
So we have to constantly adapt to make these conventions relevant to the realities of modern war.
Exactly.
Now, we've talked about the obligations of states, but what about regular people and aid societies?
Okay.
What role do they play in all of this?
Right. Does Geneva Convention 2 say anything about their involvement?
Yeah.
It does, and it's a pretty significant role.
Yep.
The convention not only allows, but actually encourages civilians and aid societies to help collect and care for the wounded, sick, and shipwrecked.
Okay.
They play a vital role in supporting official medical personnel.
Right.
Especially when resources are stretched thin.
It makes sense in the aftermath of a battle.
Yeah.
You need all hands on deck.
You do.
But are there any specific protections for these civilian volunteers?
Okay.
I mean, they're putting themselves in danger to help.
Absolutely. Geneva Convention 2 explicitly states that civilians and aid workers can't be punished for providing assistance, even if they're helping enemy personnel.
Wow.
They are protected from any kind of reprisal or legal action for their humanitarian work.
So they can act confidently, knowing they're protected.
Exactly.
And not worry about the consequences.
Right. It reinforces this idea of a broader humanitarian network, working to protect those in need no matter what side they're on.
It really shows a commitment to human life above all else.
It does.
So let's switch gears a bit and talk about something that's always interested me.
Okay.
The emblems.
All right.
You know the Red Cross, the Red Crescent? These symbols are instantly recognizable around the world.
They are.
What's their significance in the context of Geneva Convention 2nd?
They're incredibly important.
Okay.
These emblems, the Red Cross, the Red Crescent, and more recently the Red Crystal, they serve as visual identifiers of protected persons and objects.
Gotcha.
When you see these symbols on a ship, an aircraft, or someone's uniform, it means they're involved in medical activities and therefore protected under the convention.
It's like a shield. A visual declaration of neutrality.
Exactly.
A call for respect and protection.
Right.
But what happens if these emblems are misused? Like, say, by a combatant trying to trick the enemy?
That is considered a very serious offense. Okay.
A war crime, in fact.
Wow.
Misusing these emblems to gain a military advantage is a major breach of the Geneva Conventions.
Yeah.
Because it undermines the trust and legitimacy of the whole system.
I see. It erodes the very foundation of what these symbols are supposed to represent.
Exactly.
So it's not just about protecting the person who misused the emblem. It's about protecting the integrity of the entire system that's designed to protect the wounded and sick.
Absolutely. Misuse creates a dangerous precedent.
Yeah.
If these symbols lose their meaning, then they lose their power to protect those who genuinely need it.
That's a really good point.
Yeah.
Are there any notable controversies surrounding these emblems?
Yeah, there are.
I know there have been discussions about the Red Shield of David. used by Israel's Magen David Adom.
That's a very relevant example.
Yeah.
While Magen David Adom provides crucial humanitarian services, their emblem isn't currently recognized under the Geneva Conventions.
And this has led to ongoing debate and calls for its inclusion, which raises some complex questions about the universality of these symbols and the challenges of accommodating different cultural and political contexts.
It seems like navigating these complexities is an ongoing process.
It is.
Trying to balance upholding the core principles of the convention with adapting to the ever-changing world of global politics.
You've hit the nail on the head, Geneva Convention 2.
Yeah.
Like, all international law is a living document.
Okay.
It requires constant re-examination and adaptation to the changing realities of armed conflict.
Which leads us to another question.
Okay.
With the rise of non-state actors in modern conflicts, how do we even enforce these conventions when the lines between traditional combatants and civilians are blurred?
That's a question that legal scholars and policymakers are grappling with right now.
Yeah.
How do you hold non-state actors accountable to a convention that they didn't sign and might not even recognize?
Yeah, it's a tough one.
It's a challenging dilemma with no easy answers.
We're moving into uncharted territory, legally speaking.
We are.
Do you think the Geneva Conventions are even equipped to handle the challenges of 21st century warfare?
Okay.
Especially with the rise of things like autonomous weapons systems.
It's a valid concern.
Yeah.
The development of autonomous weapons systems really poses a significant challenge to the core principles of the Geneva Conventions.
Right, because how do you ensure humane treatment?
Exactly.
When you're taking the decision-making out of human hands?
It's a big question.
It's almost like we're entering a new era of warfare.
It does feel that way.
One where the old rules might not apply anymore. So where do we go from here? How do we make sure that the fundamental principles of humanity aren't lost in this rapidly changing landscape?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it?
It really is.
And it's one that we're going to explore in our final segment. We're going to delve into the future of the Geneva Conventions and discuss how we can ensure their relevance and effectiveness in a world that's changing faster than ever before.
I'm definitely looking forward to that discussion.
Me too.
So stay tuned for our final part.
Yeah.
Where we'll tackle the future of the Geneva Conventions in a world that's constantly redefining what conflict even means. Welcome back to LexTalks. We've spent the last two segments really unpacking Geneva Convention 2.
We have.
Exploring its history, its practical application, and of course all the challenges it faces in our ever-changing world.
Yeah, we've covered a lot of ground.
We have.
From the specific protections for the wounded and sick at sea to those complexities surrounding hospital ships and the role of those emblems, in signifying neutrality.
Exactly. And as we move deeper into the 21st century, it's pretty clear that the Geneva Conventions are being tested like never before.
Yeah, they really are.
We've talked about the rise of non-state actors, the blurring lines between combatants and civilians. And those new technologies like autonomous weapons systems that really challenge the foundations of international humanitarian law.
Absolutely.
So the big question is, how do we make sure these conventions stay relevant? And effective in the face of these unprecedented challenges?
Yeah, that's a question that deserves our attention for sure.
For sure.
One crucial aspect, I think, is adapting our understanding of what warfare even is.
Okay.
We need to move beyond those traditional definitions of combat and recognize that conflict isn't confined to these clearly defined battlefields anymore.
So we need to broaden our perspective.
Yeah.
Acknowledge that conflict can take many forms.
Exactly.
Cyber warfare, information warfare, economic warfare.
It's all connected.
It is. But how do we apply the principles of the Geneva Conventions to these new and often very ambiguous forms of conflict?
That's where I think we need some creative legal thinking.
Okay.
We need to reinterpret and adapt existing legal frameworks.
To address these evolving challenges.
So, for example, could we apply the principles of distinction and proportionality?
Right. Those are cornerstones of the Geneva Conventions.
They are to cyber attacks.
Right.
Can we establish clear guidelines for protecting civilians in cyberspace?
These are the questions we need to be asking.
Yeah, it seems like a pretty daunting task.
It is.
Trying to apply centuries-old legal concepts to something as fluid and dynamic as cyberspace.
Yeah, but it seems like we don't really have a choice.
True.
If we want to uphold those fundamental principles of humanity in this digital age.
Absolutely. Another crucial aspect is enforcement. How do we hold states and non-state actors accountable
Right.
for violations in these new domains?
Yeah, those traditional mechanisms of international justice,
Yeah.
they might not be enough anymore.
So we need to explore new avenues for accountability.
Exactly.
Maybe even consider creating specialized international tribunals
Right.
or courts specifically for addressing cyber warfare and other emerging forms of conflict. I think that's a great idea.
And technology itself could play a role,
It could.
both in monitoring compliance and gathering evidence of violations.
Right. Think about the potential of satellite imagery,
Okay.
artificial intelligence data analysis.
Right.
All of that could be used to document breaches of international humanitarian law.
It's like using the tools of modern warfare
Yeah.
to uphold the laws of war.
Exactly.
Leveraging technology to ensure human rights are protected even in the most technologically advanced conflicts.
I like the way you put that.
But technology alone isn't enough, is it?
No, it's not in the end.
Yeah.
It comes down to political will
Okay.
and a shared commitment to upholding these fundamental principles of humanity.
Right.
Even when it's hard, even when it's inconvenient.
Yeah, it takes effort.
It does. We need states to reaffirm their commitment to the Geneva Conventions,
Right.
to invest in training and education for their armed forces,
Right.
and to hold violators accountable no matter who they are.
It sounds like it takes a collective effort
It does.
involving states, international organizations, civil society, even individuals.
Yeah, everyone has a role to play
Right.
in making sure these conventions remain relevant and effective in the 21st century.
Yeah, you put that perfectly. The future of the Geneva Conventions really depends on us recognizing that. Even with all these technological advancements and changing forms of conflict,
Right.
those fundamental values of human dignity, compassion, and respect,
Yes.
they have to remain paramount.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
This has been a really thought-provoking conversation.
It has.
It's given me a whole new perspective on the challenges and opportunities facing international humanitarian law in the 21st century.
Absolutely.
I'm sure our listeners feel the same way.
I hope so.
The more we understand these conventions,
Right.
the more we have these important discussions,
Yeah.
the better equipped we are to advocate for them
Exactly.
and make sure that the principles of humanity prevail, even in the midst of modern warfare. Thank you for joining us for this deep dive into Geneva Convention 2.
It's been a pleasure.
It's been a truly enlightening look at a topic that's more relevant now than ever before.
I agree.
And to our listeners, thank you for tuning in to LexTalks Legal Topics Simplified.
Keep learning, everyone.
We catch you next time for another deep dive into the world of law.